The words coming out of Elijah Vaughn's mouth were the wrong ones entirely, and Alberta Lockhart knew it the moment Chief Broken Sky's expression shifted from cautious patience to something cold and dangerous. She stood at the edge of the clearing, her travel-worn leather satchel still strapped across her chest, her dark auburn hair catching the last burning copper light of the New Mexico sunset. She had ridden hard for 3 days to reach this valley. She had not ridden hard for 3 days to watch a stubborn, broad-shouldered cattleman destroy a treaty negotiation with bad Comanche because his hired interpreter had quit 2 towns back and he was attempting, God help him, to speak the language himself from a battered pamphlet he had purchased from a medicine show. Chief Broken Sky rose from his seated position. He was a man of remarkable dignity, weathered and tall, his dark eyes cutting straight through every pretense. The 2 warriors flanking him had already shifted their weight, their hands moving closer to the weapons at their sides. The chief said something in Comanche that was quiet and deliberate, the kind of quiet that preceded thunder. Elijah Vaughn, who stood at 6 feet 2 inches of solid muscle and sun-darkened skin, and who had the jaw of a man who had never once backed down from anything in his 32 years of living, went completely still. He did not understand. That was the most dangerous thing in this entire clearing. "He just told you," Alberta said, stepping forward out of the tree line, her voice carrying clear and calm across the charged air between the 2 parties, "that if you say that phrase one more time, he will consider it a declaration of war against every man who grazes cattle south of the Canadian River." Every head turned toward her. Elijah Vaughn spun around, and the look on his face was something she would remember for a long time. Shock first. Then the instinctive, frustrated authority of a man who did not appreciate being surprised from behind. Then something else entirely, something slower and more complicated, as he looked at the woman who had just walked out of the wilderness and spoken flawless Comanche to a chief who had been on the verge of ordering them both killed. "Who in the hell are you?" Elijah said. "Someone who speaks the language," Alberta replied, and she walked past him toward Chief Broken Sky, her chin lifted, her hands open and visible at her sides in the gesture she knew meant she came without deception. "And if you would kindly stop talking, I might be able to save both your cattle operation and your life." It had started, the way most disasters in Alberta Lockhart's experience started, with a letter. She had been in Santa Fe when the letter reached her, forwarded through 3 separate postal offices and one very confused fur trader from the offices of the New Mexico Territorial Surveyor. The letter was from a colleague, a fellow linguist and former professor at the University of Missouri, named Dr. Harold Finch, who had been commissioned to document the oral histories of several Comanche bands in the territory before a federal land commission arrived and changed everything irrevocably. Dr. Finch had broken his leg in 2 places while dismounting a horse outside of Tucumcari. He could not travel. He was desperate. He was willing to pay what, in 1874, was a genuinely remarkable sum of money, and he knew that Alberta Lockhart was the only woman, and possibly the only person, west of the Mississippi who had spent enough time living among the Comanche to carry on a full and nuanced conversation in their language without an interpreter. Alberta had not planned to come back to this part of New Mexico. She had spent 2 years among the Comanche people in the early 1870s, living with a band in the eastern territories of the Panhandle, learning their language with the kind of obsessive, joyful precision that had always been her peculiar genius. Languages came to her the way water came to rivers, naturally and with an irresistible pulling force. She had grown up the daughter of a frontier cartographer, moving constantly across the territories, and by the time she was 23 she spoke English, Spanish, French, and had a working knowledge of Apache and Kiowa dialects that would have made a linguist professor weep with jealousy. The Comanche she had learned differently. She had learned it by living it, by cooking over shared fires and riding the open land and listening, truly listening, for 2 years. She was 27 now, and she was in Santa Fe because she was translating a set of Spanish land grant documents for a legal firm, which paid reasonably well and required almost none of the constant riding and camping that had defined the earlier part of her life. She was not unhappy in Santa Fe. She had a comfortable room at a boarding house run by a widow named Mrs. Esperanza Ruiz, who made the finest tortillas Alberta had ever tasted, and who asked no uncomfortable questions about why a young woman was living alone and spending her days with her nose in documents. She took the commission from Dr. Finch because the money was real and because, if she was completely honest with herself in the way she rarely allowed herself to be, she missed the open country. She missed the sky above the Llano Estacado, which was the widest and most honest sky she had ever seen. She missed the smell of sage after rain. She missed the feeling of being somewhere that mattered. She did not expect to arrive at the edge of the Comanche territory and immediately discover that a cattle operation was in the process of igniting a range war. She had heard about Elijah Vaughn before she ever saw him. His reputation moved faster than his cattle drives, which were themselves said to move at a remarkable pace. He ran the Vaughn Cattle Company out of a ranch headquarters near the town of Cimarron, with grazing leases that extended across an enormous swath of territory. He was known as a fair employer and a hard worker, and a man who did not cheat at cards or welch on a debt. He was also known as a man who had recently purchased grazing rights to land that sat uncomfortably close to the traditional summer grounds of Chief Broken Sky's band, and who had sent letters to the territorial Indian agent requesting a formal meeting to establish boundaries, and who had not heard back from the Indian agent in 6 weeks because the Indian agent was currently in Albuquerque dealing with a different crisis and had entirely forgotten about this particular powder keg. Alberta had learned all of this from a rancher's wife in the town of Rayado, who had given her a meal and a place to sleep in exchange for Alberta translating a business letter her husband needed to send to a land company in Mexico City. The rancher's wife, a sharp woman named Rosa Domings, had looked at Alberta over the kitchen table and said that she hoped Alberta knew what she was riding into, because the situation to the north was the kind that ended with people buried in shallow graves. Alberta had thanked her for the warning and ridden north anyway. What she found when she came through the cedar breaks and into the wide valley where the meeting was taking place was, in a word, catastrophic. Elijah Vaughn had arrived with 3 of his ranch hands, who were positioned at the edge of the clearing with the careful alertness of men who expected trouble. Chief Broken Sky had come with 6 warriors and the quiet authority of a man who did not intend to be insulted in his own territory. And Elijah Vaughn, in what Alberta could only characterize as a deeply unfortunate display of independent initiative, had obtained his medicine show pamphlet and was attempting to communicate directly. The phrase he had been repeating, which he apparently believed meant something along the lines of, "I wish to speak as equals," actually translated, in the dialect specific to Broken Sky's band, to a deeply offensive assertion about the chief's relationship with his ancestors that Alberta was not going to repeat out loud. The fact that no blood had been spilled yet was a testament to Broken Sky's considerable patience, which was, by all visible evidence, now entirely exhausted. So she had walked out of the tree line and into the center of everything, which was, she reflected, essentially what she always did. "Tell him," Elijah said, his voice dropping to something tight and controlled once it became clear that she was, in fact, speaking Comanche and that Chief Broken Sky was, in fact, listening to her, "that I did not come here with bad intentions, that I want a boundary agreement, that my cattle will not cross into the summer grounds." "I know what you want," Alberta said without looking back at him. "Be quiet." She spoke at some length to Chief Broken Sky. She explained who she was, which required a few minutes of establishing context, because Broken Sky had met her once before, 4 years ago, when she had been traveling with his cousin's band and had helped mediate a dispute about stolen horses. She reminded him of this. She saw the recognition come into his eyes, followed by something warmer, an acknowledgement of shared history. She explained the situation with the grazing lands as she understood it. She explained that the man behind her was neither the worst kind of white cattleman nor the best, but that he appeared to be genuinely interested in a workable boundary rather than a conflict, and that she had no reason to believe he was lying about this, though she acknowledged she had known him for approximately 4 minutes. She made Chief Broken Sky laugh with this last admission, which was, she knew, the most important thing she had done in the entire conversation. They spoke for 40 minutes. Behind her, she was aware of Elijah Vaughn standing with his arms crossed and his jaw clenched, and every time she glanced back at him, his expression cycled through frustration, forced patience, and something that looked like it might be awe, though he clearly did not want it to be. By the end of the conversation, Chief Broken Sky had agreed to a preliminary boundary discussion, conditional on Alberta Lockhart being present for every meeting, and conditional on the man with the pamphlet leaving the pamphlet behind. "What did he say?" Elijah asked when she finally turned around to face him. "He said he will meet with you, 4 days from now, at the place where the Red Canyon meets the river. He wants me there." She paused. "He also wants your pamphlet." Elijah stared at her. Then he looked down at the tattered booklet in his hand, and something passed across his face that she might have described as embarrassment in a man who appeared to be the kind of person who was rarely embarrassed. He held it out to one of Broken Sky's warriors, who took it with an expression of profound skepticism. "I appreciate what you just did," Elijah said, and the words came out stiffly, as if appreciation was a suit he was not entirely comfortable wearing. "I don't know who you are or what you're doing out here, but you just prevented something that could have ended very badly." "Yes," Alberta said. "Where?" His eyes narrowed slightly at her directness. "Are you looking for work?" "I'm already employed," she said. "I'm here on a linguistics commission for a colleague of mine who is documenting oral histories, but I can't very well document anything if a range war starts, so I have a personal interest in seeing your negotiation succeed." She looked at him steadily. "I'll attend the meeting, after that we'll see." "I'll pay you," he said, as if this settled the matter. "You will," she agreed pleasantly. "Handsomely or not at all." He looked at her for a long moment and she looked back, and neither of them looked away, which was the moment when something shifted between them that neither of them was prepared to name. "Elijah Vaughn," he said, and held out his hand. "Alberta Lockhart," she said, and shook it. His hand was very large and calloused and warm, and she noticed this in a purely practical way, and then set the observation aside, because there was a great deal of practical work to be done, and she was not the kind of woman who lost her head over a handshake. They made camp separately that night, which Alberta insisted on and Elijah accepted with a curt nod that suggested he understood boundaries without needing them explained. She set up her small camp on the near side of a creek, and she could see the firelight from his larger camp through the trees, and she could hear the low voices of his ranch hands talking and occasionally laughing. It was a comfortable sound, she thought, the sound of men who trusted each other, and she fell asleep listening to the creek and the night birds and the distant murmur of other people's ease. In the morning, she woke before dawn as she always did, and she had her small fire going and her coffee heating in the tin pot she carried in her satchel when she heard footsteps approaching from the direction of his camp. She did not reach for the small pistol she carried in the left side pocket of her satchel, because she had already identified the footsteps as Elijah Vaughn's. He walked with a particular heaviness that came from a man who was both large and unconscious of the space he occupied. He appeared through the early gray light looking like he had not slept particularly well, which she found faintly satisfying in a way she did not examine too closely. "You have coffee," he said. "I do," she said. "I could smell it from my camp. That seems like a personal problem." He looked at her with an expression that was half exasperation and half something that wanted to be amusement. She poured a second cup from her tin pot and held it out. He took it and sat down on the far side of the fire, and for a few minutes they drank coffee together in the quiet pre-dawn and watched the eastern sky begin to consider the possibility of light. "You speak Comanche," he said eventually. It was not a question, but it was not exactly a statement either. It was the tone of a man who was still working out what he thought about something. "Fluently," she said, "and several other languages." "Where did you learn it?" "I lived with a band in the Eastern Panhandle for 2 years," she said. "Before that I learned Spanish and French from my father's colleagues, and Apache from a woman named Runs with Morning, who was part of a group I traveled with through the Sacramento Mountains when I was 19. He was watching her over the rim of his cup. "How old are you?" 27, she said. "How old are you?" 32. He paused. "You've been on your own since you were 19. "I've been on my own in various capacities since I was 14, she said. "My father died when I was 14. My mother had died when I was 7. There were no other family members who considered me a priority." She said this without self-pity, because self-pity was a weight she had long since decided not to carry. "I traveled with my father's surveying teams initially because I knew the men and they knew me, and then later on my own commissions." He was quiet for a moment. "That must have been hard." "It was instructive," she said. "I prefer instructive." He almost smiled at that. She could see it in the corner of his mouth, the controlled, almost expression of a man who smiled less than he might have, for reasons she had not yet determined. "What about you?" she asked, because fairness required the question and because she was, underneath all her practicality, genuinely curious about people. "I came out from Virginia after the war," he said. 1867. "I was 25. I had nothing in Virginia worth staying for, and I had heard that cattle was the way to rebuild something." He looked into his cup. "It took 7 years of work that would have killed a weaker man, but I built the Vaughn operation into what it is. 400 head of cattle on a good day, 30 miles of grazing land, 8 men on the payroll." "You're proud of that," she said. "Not a challenge, just an observation." "I worked for it," he said simply. "What were you doing before the war?" she asked. Something in his expression closed slightly, not hostile, just careful. "Farming," he said. "My family farmed." He looked up at her. "I grew up with people who depended on slave labor. I'm not proud of that. I didn't participate in it, but I grew up inside it, and by the time I understood what that meant, the war was already starting." He held her gaze. "I want you to know that because I don't like secrets, and I don't want you working with me under false assumptions about who I am." Alberta looked at him carefully. There were men in the West who spoke about such things as if the words absolved them, and there were men who spoke about such things as if the words were the beginning of a reckoning they intended to carry with them. He had the voice of the second kind of man. "I appreciate your honesty," she said. "I spent 2 years with the Comanche people, and I have seen enough of what has been done to the indigenous people of this territory to know that the cattle business and the land business are not separate from those injustices." She looked at him steadily. "I need you to understand that when I negotiate for you with Chief Broken Sky, I will not misrepresent the situation to benefit you at his expense. I will translate accurately and completely, including things you might not want to hear. I wouldn't have it any other way," he said, and he meant it. They sat with that understanding between them for a moment, and the sun came up over the eastern ridge and turned the creek gold, and Alberta refilled his cup because the pot was there, and because it seemed like the right thing to do. Over the next 4 days, while they waited for the boundary meeting, they traveled together toward the canyon meeting point. Elijah's 3 ranch hands. A quiet young man named Pete Caro, who was maybe 20 and didn't talk much. An older Mexican cowboy named Domingo Reyes, who had been riding for the Vaughn operation since the beginning. And a wiry, sharp-eyed man named Cal Briggs, who Alberta immediately identified as both the most competent and the most suspicious of the group, established a kind of careful respect with her that felt real rather than performed. Domingo Reyes, on the second day of travel, asked her in Spanish whether she had been to the missions along the Rio Grande, and she answered him in Spanish, and they had a conversation about the ruins of Pico's Pueblo that lasted an hour, and that Elijah listened to with the patient expression of a man who understood none of it but was fascinated anyway. "What were you talking about?" he asked, when she and Domingo had finished. "History," she said. "The ancient history of this land. It's quite remarkable." "Do you know that much about everywhere you've been?" "I collect history the way some people collect silver," she said. "It's lighter to carry." That almost smile again, closer to the surface this time. Cal Briggs was the problem, as she had anticipated. On the third evening, while Domingo was cooking beans and Pete was tending the horses, Cal came to sit near where Alberta was writing in her journal and said, in the tone of a man who was trying to sound casual, that he wasn't sure it was wise to have a woman doing the negotiating. He said it wasn't a personal opinion, he said, just a practical concern. Alberta set down her pen, capped her ink bottle carefully, and looked at Cal Briggs. "What language were you planning to negotiate in?" she asked. "Well," Cal said, and then stopped. "I can speak to Chief Broken Sky in his own language," she said, "in the specific dialect of his band, with the appropriate forms of address and the cultural context that makes the difference between being heard and being dismissed. Can you do that?" "No," Cal admitted. "Then your concern," she said pleasantly, "is noted and set aside. Thank you, Cal." Cal went back to the fire looking like a man who had tried to pick a fight with a stone wall and discovered it was unmovable. Elijah, who had heard the entire exchange from where he was checking his horse's shoes, met her eyes across the campfire, and this time the smile made it all the way to his face. It lasted only a second, but it was genuine and warm, and it hit her somewhere in the chest with the force of something unexpected. She looked back at her journal and began writing again, and she did not acknowledge what she had just felt, because acknowledging it would require thinking about it, and thinking about it would be a distraction from the work, and the work was the most important thing. She was very good at telling herself this. On the fourth day, they reached the canyon meeting point, where the red rock walls came down to meet the river in a wide, flat area shaded by cottonwood trees. Chief Broken Sky was already there with his party, which had grown from 6 warriors to 12, a number that Elijah registered with a slight tightening around the eyes. "He brought more men," Elijah said quietly beside her. "So did you," Alberta pointed out. She had noticed that 2 additional Vaughn riders had come up in the night, bringing the total to 5. "Let me speak to him first. Stay here." She walked forward alone, which she knew made a statement that she intended to make. She greeted Broken Sky formally, using the full honorific greeting that acknowledged his position and his lineage, and she saw the appreciation in his expression. He told her that he had told his council about her presence, and that some of them remembered her from her time in the Panhandle. He told her that one elder, a woman named Yellow Sage, had asked him to give Alberta her specific regard, and the specific Comanche phrase that meant something close to the idea that a woman's word carries the weight of the earth she has walked on. Alberta received this message with genuine emotion that she kept carefully contained. She turned and called Elijah forward, and the negotiation began. It lasted nearly 5 hours. Alberta was in her element in a way she had not been in a long time, and she knew it, and she let herself feel the rightness of it without apology. She moved between the 2 men, between the 2 languages, between 2 completely different ways of understanding land and cattle and territory and respect, and she did not simplify either party to the other. When Chief Broken Sky described the significance of the summer grounds in terms that were spiritual and generational, she translated that significance faithfully and fully. When Elijah described his need for reliable water access and predictable grazing boundaries in terms that were economic and logistical, she translated that with the same fidelity. She was not a bridge that flattened everything to the same level. She was a bridge that honored the height of both banks. There were 2 moments when the negotiation nearly broke down. The first was when one of Elijah's riders, Cal Briggs, who appeared to have the instinct of a man who distrusted silence, made a comment under his breath that was not intended to be heard by the chief's party, but was in fact completely audible to Alberta, and she suspected. to at least two of the Comanche warriors who had been watching him with particular attention. She did not translate the comment. Instead, she turned to Cal with an expression so direct and quiet that he took a step backward. "If you speak again during this negotiation," she said, in a voice pitched only for him, "I will translate everything you said to Chief Broken Sky accurately, and you will deal personally with the consequences." Cal did not speak again. The second breakdown came over a specific stretch of land where the proposed boundary intersected with a seasonal spring that both parties considered essential. This was not bad faith on either side. This was genuine conflict, two real needs occupying the same physical space, and it was the kind of problem that could not be solved by goodwill alone. Alberta asked both parties to pause. She thought for a moment, considering what she knew about water law and range agreements and Comanche traditions around shared resources. Then she proposed something that she had not been asked to propose, a shared access agreement for the spring, with seasonal rotation, and a protocol for dispute resolution that drew on a specific Comanche practice she had learned during her time with the Eastern Band. Elijah stared at her when she presented this in English. "That was your idea," he said. "Yes," she said. "Do you object to it?" He stopped. He looked at her with an expression she had not yet seen on his face, one that she could only describe as complete and total surprise, followed by something that looked very much like admiration. Not the polite, condescending admiration of a man who was surprised a woman could read, but the genuine, involuntary admiration of someone watching a person do something that they themselves could not have done. It was the look of a man recognizing a superior mind at work and finding, to his apparent astonishment, that this recognition did not threaten him but rather moved him deeply. "No," he said, "I don't object to it." Chief Broken Sky accepted the proposal. By the end of the 5th hour, there was a preliminary agreement in place, to be formalized in a written document that Alberta would draft in both English and Spanish, with a Comanche oral version that she would commit to speaking aloud before witnesses, which was the form of agreement that carried the most meaning in Broken Sky's culture. When it was done, and both parties were preparing to leave, Chief Broken Sky spoke directly to Alberta one final time. She listened carefully and then nodded, and when he and his party had departed into the canyon, she stood for a moment in the sudden quiet of the cottonwood shade and let herself take a single breath that was entirely about relief. "What did he say?" Elijah asked, coming to stand beside her. "He said," she translated, "that the land has been waiting for someone to speak to it honestly. He said he hoped I would stay in this territory rather than traveling through it." She paused. "He also said that the tall man looks at me the way a man looks at something he does not yet know how to ask for." The silence between them lasted for several long seconds. "And what did you say to that?" Elijah asked, his voice carefully even. "I said the chief was very observant," Alberta replied, and she picked up her satchel and walked toward the horses before he could see the color that had come into her face. That night the two camps became, by a natural and unplanned process, one camp. Pete had built a central fire, and Domingo had produced from somewhere in his pack a supply of chili peppers and dried venison that he combined with beans and flatbread into a meal that was, by frontier standards, genuinely excellent. Cal Briggs was quiet, which was an improvement. The stars above the canyon were extraordinary, thick and brilliant in the black sky, the kind of stars that made a person feel both very small and very grateful to be alive to see them. Alberta sat with her journal, writing up the complete record of the negotiation while it was fresh. Elijah sat nearby, reading a worn copy of a surveyor's map that he had unfolded across his knees. They were not talking, but they were occupying the same space with a comfort that had not existed 4 days ago and that Alberta was not entirely sure how to categorize. "Tell me about the 2 years you spent with the Comanche," he said, without looking up from his map. She looked up from her journal. "Why?" "Because I want to understand what I'm negotiating about," he said. "I want to understand the land and the people the way you understand them. I'm aware that I've been operating with a significant deficit of knowledge, and that deficit nearly cost me everything yesterday." He looked up. "I'm not a proud man in the way that prevents learning." She studied him for a moment. Then she closed her journal. She told him about arriving with a fur traders' party in the Eastern Panhandle in 1871, when she was 23, with a commission to document trading vocabularies for a St. Louis merchant company that proved to be far less interesting than the actual work of language documentation that she found herself doing instead. She told him about the woman named Running Elk's wife, who had first invited her to stay past the initial contact period, who had taught her to cook over a buffalo chip fire, and had laughed with great warmth and honesty at Alberta's early language mistakes. She told him about the rhythm of the seasons as the band moved with the buffalo, the spring migrations and the summer camps, and the way the community organized itself around the shared work of survival, with a sophistication that most of the people who dismissed the Comanche as primitive would have found humbling. She told him about the things she had seen that had been wrong and unjust, the encroachments on territory, the broken promises from federal agents, the deliberate destruction of the buffalo herds by hide hunters, who knew exactly what the elimination of the buffalo meant for the people who depended on them. She told him about this with the direct, clear anger of someone who had witnessed it and who had spent years sitting with the weight of bearing witness to something she could not undo. He listened to all of it without interrupting. He asked good questions, thoughtful ones, and he did not get defensive when she spoke about the injustices, which was a choice she respected more than almost anything else she had seen from him. "I didn't know about the buffalo," he said, when she mentioned the hide hunters. "I mean, I knew they were being hunted. I didn't think about what it meant beyond the economics of it." "Most people don't," she said. "It's easier not to." "That's not an excuse I'm comfortable with," he said. "I know," she said. "That's why I told you." Something passed between them in the firelight, not the charged, complicated thing she had been carefully not thinking about, but something underneath that, something quieter and more solid, an understanding, a shared sense of what honesty was for. "You should be a professor," he said, "or a diplomat." "I've been told both," she said. "I prefer being where the actual language is spoken." "You prefer the field," he said. "I prefer," she said, "being useful." He was quiet for a moment, looking into the fire. "I had a wife," he said. The words came out slowly, like something he was not accustomed to saying. "She died in 1871, fever." Alberta was quiet, listening. "We had been married 2 years," he said. "She came out from Virginia with me. She was brave and she was good, and she died before any of the work we had done together came to anything." He paused. "I've been running the ranch on momentum since then. It gives me something to do that's large enough to fill the space." "I understand that," Alberta said. "I imagine you do," he said, looking at her. They stayed by the fire a long time after that, sometimes talking and sometimes not. And when she finally went to her bedroll, she lay awake listening to the river and thinking about the way he had said her name earlier in the day, in the middle of the negotiation, when he had wanted to tell her something important and had used her first name without deciding to. The way people used names when they had stopped thinking about whether they should. Alberta. Not Miss Lockhart, which was what he had been calling her for 4 days with careful formality. Just her name, clear and simple in his deep Virginia-roughened voice. She fell asleep thinking about nothing in particular. The next morning she drafted the boundary agreement document, which took several hours because she drafted it in English and Spanish simultaneously. And then she worked with Pete Caro, who had more education than he generally let on, to produce a clean final copy. She also worked privately for a further hour on the oral Comanche version, making sure the phrasing was not simply translated but actually conceptually complete in the logic of the Comanche language, because a mistranslation in a formal oral agreement could introduce ambiguities that would cause trouble years later. Elijah watched her work. He didn't hover, but he was present, and she was aware of him in the way she had not been aware of anyone in a long time, not intrusively but simply as a persistent fact of her environment, like the sound of the river or the warmth of the sun on her shoulders. "How long will you be in the territory?" he asked, when she was on the final page. "My commission from Dr. Finch is open-ended," she said. "6 weeks minimum, possibly more. He wants oral histories from several different bands, not just Broken Skies." She paused. "Why?" "I'm going to need someone to help me see the boundary agreement through," he said. "Make sure the written version and the oral version match. Make sure there are no misunderstandings as we start working near the boundary lines. Translate any communications that need to go back and forth." He looked at her steadily. "I know you said you have your own work. I'm not asking you to set that aside. I'm asking whether the two can be compatible." She thought about it honestly. The oral history work required her to spend time with Broken Skies Band, which was where she would need to be anyway to fulfill Dr. Finch's commission. Being available to translate for Elijah during that time was not a conflict. It was, in fact, the kind of arrangement that made both projects stronger. "They can be compatible," she said, "with conditions. Name them." "I don't work for you in the sense that you can direct my schedule," she said. "I work in parallel with you on my own commission, and I assist with the boundary work as a separate engagement. My translations are always complete and accurate, including things that reflect poorly on your position. You don't tell me how to translate. You don't tell me what to say to Chief Broken Sky." "Agreed," he said, without hesitation. "And Cal Briggs," she said. "I'll talk to Cal," he said. "You'll more than talk to him," she said. "He is the most likely single person to derail this agreement if he continues behaving the way he behaved yesterday. I understand he's a good rider and you trust him, but trust in the saddle doesn't transfer automatically to diplomacy." Elijah looked at her with that particular expression she was beginning to recognize, the one that meant he was deciding whether to bristle and had decided not to. "You're right," he said. "I'll handle it." And he did, in a conversation with Cal that Alberta was not present for, but that resulted in Cal approaching her the following morning with the posture of a man doing something uncomfortable. "I was out of line," Cal said. "I don't want to cause problems for the operation." "I appreciate you saying so," Alberta said. "I know change is uncomfortable." "You're different than what I expected," Cal said, and this was clearly intended as a compliment, though it had the awkward shape of one that had not been fully thought through before being delivered. "I'll take that as a positive observation," she said, and went back to her work, and Cal walked away looking like a man who had somehow gotten away with something. Over the following 2 weeks, they established a working rhythm that, Alberta acknowledged privately, was unlike any professional arrangement she had previously had. She traveled with Elijah's party as they moved cattle along the boundaries of the new agreement. She conducted her oral history sessions with Broken Skies Band in the early mornings and late afternoons, and she documented and translated everything with the meticulous precision that was her deepest professional habit. She began to understand Elijah Vaughn's operation from the inside. She watched the way he managed his men, which was with a combination of clear authority and genuine respect that she found she admired. He remembered which of his riders had a sick mother in Texas and asked after her. He knew which horses were unreliable on muddy ground and planned accordingly. He did not ask anyone to do work he was not willing to do himself, and the work he was willing to do was, she noted, considerable. He was teaching himself, slowly and deliberately, through questions he asked her in the evenings. Not Comanche, which was far too complex to learn incidentally, but the history and culture that informed the language, the things that made the words mean what they meant. He read a book she had in her satchel, a collection of ethnographic notes she had made during her 2 years in the Panhandle, and returned it to her one morning with careful handling, and a comment about the passage she had written regarding the Comanche relationship to the horse that was the comment of a person who had genuinely thought about what he had read. "You should publish this," he said, holding the journal. "It's a working document," she said. "It's a remarkable piece of scholarship," he said. "I'm not saying that to flatter you. I'm saying it because I've read enough bad writing to recognize good writing, and this is exceptional." She took the journal back and looked at him. He was not trying to impress her. He was simply saying what he believed to be true, in the way she was beginning to understand was his way. She found it both unusual and deeply appealing. "Thank you," she said, and meant it. The night the Comanche oral history session with Yellow Sage happened was the night that Alberta felt the full and irreversible weight of what she was carrying emotionally. Yellow Sage was very old and very wise, and she spoke to Alberta in the confidential tone of an elder sharing something that was meant specifically for the listener and no one else. She told Alberta about her own husband, who had died many years ago, and about the particular quality of the loneliness that followed when a person who had been completely known by someone else was suddenly alone in the world with all of that knowing, and no one to direct it toward. "You are like that," Yellow Sage said, in Comanche, studying Alberta's face across the fire. "You have so much knowing and nowhere for it to rest." Alberta stayed with this for a long time that night, walking back to camp in the dark, listening to the crickets and the distant low sounds of Elijah's cattle settling for the night. She was not a woman who had avoided feeling things. She was a woman who had, very deliberately and for very rational reasons, avoided building her life around the expectation of another person. Her early years had taught her that people left or died, and that the only structure you could fully rely on was the one you built yourself. She had a career that was hers. She had skills that were hers. She had a mind that was entirely hers, and that no circumstance had yet managed to reduce or diminish. These were things she was proud of and would not trade for anything. But Yellow Sage was right about the knowing with nowhere to rest, and walking through the dark toward the camp where Elijah Vaughn would be awake by the fire, as he often was, and would look up when she came in with an expression that was not merely professional interest. She felt the weight of that truth pressing against her chest like something warm and insistent. He was awake when she came in. He was working on a set of accounts by lamplight, his reading glasses, which he wore with the self-consciousness of a man who considered them a private matter, perched on his nose. She sat down on the opposite side of the fire. "How was it?" he asked, without looking up from his accounts. "Profound," she said. "Yellow Sage is one of the most remarkable people I have ever met." He put his pen down and looked at her. "You look moved." "I am," she said. "She said something to me that I'm still working through." "Do you want to talk about it?" She considered this. "She said I have too much knowing and nowhere for it to rest." He was quiet for a moment, and then he folded his glasses carefully and set them on top of his accounts, and he looked at her across the fire with an expression that had nothing careful or measured about it. It was just him, looking at her, with everything he had been not quite saying for the past 2 weeks visible in his face. "I think about you constantly," he said, and the simplicity of it was more striking than anything elaborate would have been. Alberta looked at him for a long time. The fire crackled. A night bird called once from the cottonwoods. "I know," she said. "I think about you too." "I don't know how to ask for something I don't have a category for," he said. "You're not anyone I know how to describe using any comparison I have." He paused. "That's not a complaint. I just want you to know that whatever I'm feeling isn't something I've felt before, and I'm trying to be honest about that rather than pretending I'm more practiced at it than I am." "I appreciate honesty above almost everything else," she said. "I know," he said. "I've noticed." She stood up and walked around the fire to where he was sitting, which was not something she had planned but which felt, once she was doing it, entirely natural. She sat down beside him, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched, and she looked into the fire and let herself feel the warmth of his presence without running from it. "I am not a woman who will give up my work," she said quietly. "I would never ask you to," he said, equally quiet. "I am not a woman who will become an appendage to someone else's life." "I know," he said. "Your life is a full and astonishing thing. I would want to be part of it, not a replacement for it." She turned her head and looked at him, very close now. His face in the firelight was all strong angles and careful attention, and his eyes were the particular dark gray of a sky before a storm that was going to be both violent and necessary. "Elijah," she said. "Alberta," he said. He kissed her the way she had half known he would, not tentatively, because he was not a tentative man, but with a careful deliberateness that asked a question at the same time as it made an offer. She answered both. The rest of that night was spent mostly talking, which was not what either of them might have predicted, but which was, she thought afterward, exactly right. They sat by the fire until it burned down and talked about Virginia, and about Santa Fe, and about the language of the Comanche, and about what a cattle operation on the frontier actually meant for the future of the land and what responsibility came with that kind of land use, and about books they had read, and about the particular quality of the sky in different parts of the territory they had each traveled through. She told him about the cartography she had learned from her father, and he told her about the first cattle drive he had managed, which had been a near disaster in the first 3 days and a genuine success by the end of 3 months, and about the specific kind of satisfaction that came from bringing something large and dangerous and complicated to a successful conclusion through sheer stubbornness. "Is that what this is?" she asked, smiling. "Bringing something complicated to a successful conclusion." He looked at her with warmth that was entirely unguarded, which was, she was learning, how he looked when he had given up defending himself against something. "I certainly hope so." 2 days later, one of Elijah's ranch hands, Domingo Reyes, came riding in hard from the direction of Cimarron with word that had traveled the long way around. There was a man named Horace Crane in town, a land speculator from Kansas, who had been making inquiries about the Vaughn grazing leases and about the status of the Comanche territory. Crane had apparently arrived with a letter from a federal land commissioner and the specific intention of declaring the boundary agreement null because, he claimed, no formal agreement between a private cattle operation and an indigenous band had legal standing under current territorial law. This was the kind of threat that hit Elijah like a physical blow, and Alberta watched him absorb it with the contained stillness of a man who was fighting very hard not to respond to bad news with a response he would regret. "He's wrong," Alberta said, when Domingo had finished his report. "The agreement has legal standing. It's a land use agreement, not a treaty, which means it falls under different jurisdiction. And the territorial governor's office has the authority to validate it, which is what we need to do." Elijah looked at her. "You know territorial law. I spent 3 years translating land grant documents in Santa Fe," she said. "I know enough." She was already thinking, moving through the problem with the particular speed her mind operated at when it found a task genuinely worth working on. "We need to go to Cimarron and deal with Crane directly. And we need to document the agreement in a form that the territorial governor's office can review and validate, which means the written version needs to meet specific legal standards I can help you establish." "How quickly can we be in Cimarron?" 2 days hard riding," she said. "One if we start now." They started now. The ride to Cimarron was hard and fast, and covered some of the most beautiful territory Alberta had seen in the whole of her time in New Mexico, broken red country with cedar breaks and sudden valleys, and the long view south toward the mountains that seemed to recede as you rode toward them. She and Elijah rode at the front of the group, and they talked when the ground was smooth enough for easy riding, and when the ground was too rough they rode in companionable silence, which was its own form of communication. He told her during a long stretch of open mesa about the specific way the cattle operation would need to change if the Crane threat was real, which was with the straightforward, problem-solving practicality of a man who dealt with bad news by planning rather than panicking. She told him that the Crane threat was manageable if they moved quickly, which was both true and the most useful thing she could offer. "I've been thinking about the Oral History Commission," she said, toward the end of the second day's riding, as the lights of Cimarron appeared in the distance. "When Dr. Finch recovers from his injury, he'll want to publish the findings." I want to make sure the Comanche people have a say in what gets published and how. Elijah looked at her. Can you arrange that? I can make it a condition of the commission, she said. I've been thinking about drafting a letter to Finch that establishes a protocol for community consent. It's not something that's been done in this kind of academic work before, but it should be. That matters to you a great deal. It does, she said. I have spent time with these people. I owe them honesty and respect, and whatever practical protections I can offer against the ways that academic work can be as harmful as land speculation when it's done without accountability. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, you should write that letter, and if Finch objects, I'll personally fund the independent publication of the histories in whatever form you determine is appropriate. She turned to look at him, surprised. I have money, he said, with a slight shrug that was very nearly modest. I don't always know the right thing to do with it, but that sounds like the right thing. She reached out and briefly covered his hand where it rested on the saddle horn, and he turned his hand to cover hers, and they rode like that into Cimarron, which was a small town with a large reputation and a hotel that had seen better decades but still had rooms with working doors and adequate beds. Horace Crane was a red-faced man of 50, with the professional confidence of someone who had never had a plan not work out for him, which Alberta recognized immediately as his central vulnerability. He had set himself up in the hotel dining room as if it were his personal office, with papers spread across the table and a glass of whiskey at his elbow, and when Elijah walked in and Alberta walked in beside him, Crane's expression cycled through several phases before settling on dismissive pleasantry. Vaughn, he said, I was expecting you. I hear you've got a situation with the Comanche territory. I have a boundary agreement with Chief Broken Sky, Elijah said. It's legally documented and I'm filing it with the territorial governor's office. Crane's eyes moved to Alberta. And who is this? This is Alberta Lockhart, Elijah said. She's the linguist who drafted the boundary agreement and she knows territorial land law considerably better than either of us. Crane smiled the smile of a man who had already dismissed her before she had opened her mouth. Well now, he said. Alberta set her traveling satchel on the table and removed from it the complete documentation she had spent the previous evening preparing by lamplight, including the boundary agreement, a summary of the relevant territorial statutes, a letter she had drafted in Elijah's name to the governor's office, and a separate document citing the specific precedents that established the legal validity of private land use agreements with indigenous communities under current New Mexico territorial law. She placed these in front of Crane and watched his expression change as he read. The commissioner's letter you're carrying, she said, is from Commissioner Hart's office in Kansas, which has no jurisdiction over New Mexico territory. The relevant authority is Governor Giddings, who took office in 1871. I have drafted a request for his formal validation of this agreement, and that request goes out tomorrow by the fastest possible post. She looked at Crane calmly. If you intend to challenge this agreement, you will need to do so in Santa Fe, before the territorial court, using legal arguments that I have already anticipated and addressed in the documentation you are currently reading. I welcome the attempt. The room was entirely quiet for a moment. Crane set the papers down. He looked at Elijah. She always talked like this. When she's being polite, Elijah said. Crane looked at the documents again. He was a smart enough man, Alberta had determined, to recognize when he was outmaneuvered. The pleasantry faded from his face, replaced by something more calculating. The land commissioner's interest in this area isn't going away, he said. There are larger forces at work here than your grazing agreement, Vaughn. There are always larger forces at work, Alberta said. The agreement is sound, the documentation is complete, and the community consent is documented. Whatever larger forces choose to do, they will have to go through a legally validated agreement and a territorial court challenge to undo it. That's not impossible, but it's considerably harder than simply declaring it void over a whiskey in a hotel dining room. She paused. If the Land Commission wants to acquire this territory, I would suggest they begin by contacting the governor's office directly and making a lawful proposal. I would also suggest they engage a translator, because Chief Broken Sky will not negotiate in any language except his own. Crane looked at her for a long moment. Then he picked up his whiskey, drained it, and gathered his papers. "I'll be in contact," he said to Elijah. "I look forward to it," Elijah said. After Crane had left, Elijah looked at Alberta, and she could see something in his expression that was close to the same look he had given her in the canyon, the deep, involuntary admiration, but this time there was no surprise in it. This time it was just conviction, the look of a man who had already made up his mind about something and was simply settling into the certainty of it. "Alberta Lockhart," he said. "Elijah Vaughn," she said. "Marry me," he said. It came out with the same simplicity as his earlier declaration, not as a rehearsed speech, but as a statement of something that was simply true. "I know it's fast, and I know you have every right to say no, and I know your life is complete without me in it. But I want to be in it. I want all of it, the languages and the scholarship and the riding into impossible situations and the coffee at dawn and the arguments and all of it. I want to be the person you come back to." She looked at him across the hotel dining room, which smelled of tobacco and old wood and the particular dust of a cattle town, which was not the most romantic setting a woman could hope for, and which was, she thought, entirely appropriate for who they both were. "I want that too," she said. "I have some conditions." "You always have conditions," he said, with the full warm smile she had been waiting weeks to see at full strength. It was remarkable, that smile, the kind that changed the entire architecture of a face. "I continue my linguistics work," she said. "My own commissions, my own publication schedule, my own schedule of travel when research requires it. Yes. The ranch operates with fair wages and fair conditions for all employees, including any new employees we hire. Always has," he said. "And we go back to Broken Sky's territory, and I finish the oral history commission properly before we make any other plans. I would expect nothing less," he said. He crossed the room to her, which he did in about 3 steps because his stride was very long, and when he was standing in front of her, he took both her hands in his very large, calloused, warm ones and looked at her with everything he had. "Is that a yes?" he asked. "That is an unequivocal yes," she said. They were married in Cimarron 6 weeks later, on a day that was clear and cold with a wind from the north that brought the smell of the mountains down into the town. The ceremony was performed by a justice of the peace in the presence of Domingo Reyes and his wife, who had traveled up from the ranch for the occasion, Pete Caro, who had bought a new shirt for the event and looked extremely uncomfortable in it, and a small group of residents from the town who had heard about the linguist woman who had faced down Horace Crane in the hotel dining room and wanted to see for themselves what she looked like. Cal Briggs was also there, standing in the back with his hat in his hands, looking like a man who had reconsidered a number of his previous opinions and was still in the process of adjusting. Yellow Sage had sent a gift through one of Broken Sky's young riders. It was a small, beautifully made pouch of buffalo hide, containing a piece of cedar and a piece of sage tied together, and a message that Alberta translated for Elijah as, "The knowing has found its resting place." Alberta wore her best traveling dress, which was practical green wool and absolutely not a wedding dress, and she had her auburn hair pinned up rather than braided, and she carried the pouch from Yellow Sage in her left hand while the justice of the peace read the words over them. And she felt, standing beside the tall, steady warmth of Elijah Vaughn in the cold wind with the mountains behind him, something that she did not have a word for in any of the 5 languages she spoke, which she found delightfully interesting. The ranch at Cimarron was larger than she had imagined. It was built of adobe and timber with a wide covered porch and a large main room that had books in it already, which she had not expected, and which she took as a deeply positive sign. The kitchen was well appointed by frontier standards, and there were 2 rooms beyond the main bedroom that were clearly intended for eventual children, though they currently served as storage, and in one case, a secondary office where Elijah managed his accounts. She immediately claimed the secondary office for her own work, which he had already moved his account materials out of before she arrived, which was the kind of practical consideration she found almost unbearably thoughtful. She set up her desk with her journals and her reference volumes and her ink and her particular arrangement of pens, and she stood in the middle of the room and looked at it, her work in this space that was also his space, and she felt the solid ground of a life that was genuinely hers in a new way, not alone but not diminished. The first year was a good one and also a hard one, which was the nature of first years. The boundary agreement was validated by Governor Giddings in the spring, which neutralized the Crane situation, though Crane did write 2 threatening letters that Alberta responded to with letters so precisely and mercilessly legal that he did not write again. The cattle operation expanded slightly with the addition of a new grazing lease to the east, and Alberta made 2 additional trips to Broken Skies territory to continue the oral history work and to maintain the relationships that underpinned the agreement. She also wrote the letter to Dr. Finch about community consent, and Finch, who was a better man than he was a horseman, accepted every condition she stipulated, and the oral histories were eventually published in a form that had been reviewed and approved by representatives of the communities whose histories they contained. This was not the standard practice. Alberta intended it to become the standard practice, and she said so in her published introduction to the collection, clearly and without apology. She missed the road sometimes. She was honest with Elijah about this, and he was honest back, which was that he missed having all his energy pointed at a single goal with no one else's well-being to account for. They were both people who had built their identities around a certain kind of freedom, and they were both discovering, somewhat to their mutual surprise, that the kind of freedom they actually wanted was not the kind that came from being unbeholden to anyone. It was the kind that came from being completely and honestly known by someone who chose you anyway. In the late spring of that first year, she told him she was expecting a child. She told him the way she told him everything important, directly and sitting down with his full attention. He did not perform joy, which she would have found slightly false. Instead, he looked at her for a long moment with an expression that was deep and still, and that she recognized by now as the expression he wore when he was experiencing something larger than his ordinary vocabulary. "Are you all right?" he asked, which was the first thing he said, and it was the right thing. "I'm well," she said. "I'm somewhat terrified and also very pleased." "Both reasonable," he said. He took her hands. "We'll figure it out together." "We always do," she said. Their son was born in the autumn of 1875, a serious and healthy boy with Elijah's dark hair and Alberta's gray eyes, whom they named Henry Franklin Vaughn, after Alberta's father, who had been named Henry, and Elijah's elder brother Franklin, who had died in the war. Henry was, from the beginning, a child of formidable curiosity, who looked at everything with the concentrated attention of someone who intended to understand it completely, which Alberta felt was an extremely promising trait. Elijah held Henry for the first time with the careful overwhelm of a large man handling something infinitely precious, and Alberta watched from the bed where she was still recovering from a labor that had been long but not dangerous, and she thought about Yellow Sage's words about the knowing finding its resting place, and she thought that perhaps the knowing was not a static thing. Perhaps it kept expanding and finding new places to rest. And this seemed to her to be the most hopeful and most demanding truth she had encountered. She was back at her desk within 3 weeks, which Elijah did not try to argue with, though he did rearrange his own schedule so that he was in the house more during those weeks, which he presented as necessary ranch business, and which she accepted without comment because it was a kindness she did not need to name to appreciate. When Henry was 4 months old, she made a trip to Broken Skies territory to deliver copies of the finalized oral history documents, and she brought Henry with her in the carrying frame that, one of the women from town had shown her how to make. Chief Broken Sky received her with great ceremony and spoke at length about the importance of the documentation. Yellow Sage, who was now very old and somewhat frail, held Henry with complete authority and spoke to him in Comanche, and Henry stared at her with that concentrated gray-eyed attention, and Yellow Sage laughed and said in Comanche that this child would understand many languages and that this was a very good thing for the world to have. Alberta carried this home and told Elijah, who said that he had no doubt about it at all. The years that followed were shaped by the twin rhythms of the cattle operation and Alberta's work, which continued to expand as her reputation in linguistics and frontier documentation grew. She took on additional commissions. She corresponded with academics in St. Louis and Philadelphia, and once, in a deeply satisfying exchange of letters, with a linguist in London who had read her published introduction to the oral histories and wanted to discuss her methodology regarding community consent. She wrote her own scholarly paper on the structural patterns of Comanche grammar, which was published in an academic journal in 1877, and which was reviewed by a professor at Harvard, who called it the most significant contribution to Plains Indian linguistics in the decade. Elijah read the review and kept it. She found it years later folded into the inside front cover of one of his account books, which was where he kept things that were important. The Vaughn operation grew steadily through the late 1870s and into the 1880s, not recklessly but solidly, with the kind of growth that came from good management and fair dealing, and a reputation for not welching on agreements. Elijah trained young Pete Caro up into a foreman role, and Pete proved excellent at it, quiet and precise and completely reliable. Domingo Reyes eventually retired to a small property near the Rio Grande with his wife and his considerable collection of chili pepper varieties, and visited every Christmas with his family, which grew to include 5 children over the years. Cal Briggs, after a period of adjustment that lasted longer than anyone would have preferred, became one of the most reliable people in the operation, and on one notable occasion attempted to learn some Spanish from Domingo and reported to Alberta that language was harder than it looked. "It looks extremely hard," Alberta told him. "You make it look easy," he said, which was the most gracious thing she had ever heard Cal say. The spring of 1878 brought their second child, a girl they named Elijah Vaughn, after Domingo's wife Rosa, who had been a consistent presence in their lives, and after Elijah's mother. Rosa was, from birth, nothing like her brother. Where Henry observed quietly, Rosa announced herself with full voice and complete confidence, and an apparent determination to be in the center of every situation. Alberta found this enormously entertaining. Elijah found it terrifying in the particular way that large, calm men are terrified by small, forceful people who will not be managed. "She's exactly like you," he said one evening, watching 3-year-old Rosa instruct the ranch dog on proper behavior using a combination of Spanish words she had picked up from Domingo and gestures she had apparently invented herself. "She's her own person," Alberta said, "but yes, some resemblance." He put his arm around her and they watched their daughter conduct her lesson in the late afternoon light, and the dog, who was a wise animal, sat and listened attentively. The land questions did not disappear in those years. The federal presence in New Mexico Territory grew through the late 1870s, and the pressures on the Comanche people and other indigenous communities increased as the buffalo herds continued to be devastated by commercial hunting, and as land speculators and settlers pressed continuously at the boundaries of established territories. Alberta watched this with the clear-eyed grief of someone who had predicted it and could not stop it, and she continued to do what she could, which was documenting, translating, witnessing, and making sure that the agreements and histories that existed were recorded in forms that could not easily be erased. Chief Broken Sky died in 1879 after a winter illness, and the news reached Alberta through a rider sent specifically to bring it to her, which was a gesture of trust and connection that meant more to her than most formal honors she had received. She and Elijah rode out together to pay their respects, and the man who succeeded Broken Sky, a younger leader named Hawk Standing, had known of Alberta for years and received her with the respect owed to someone who had been named a trusted voice by his predecessor. The boundary agreement held. In the shifting and frequently hostile landscape of territorial land management in the 1880s, this was not a small thing. Alberta knew exactly why it held. It was specific. It was documented in multiple forms. It had been validated by the territorial authority, and it had been maintained on both sides by people who understood that a promise was not a courtesy but a structure, something you built and then lived inside. In 1880, she was asked by the territorial governor's office to consult on a broader land use negotiation involving several bands and several cattle operations, a commission that took her away from Cimarron for 2 months, and that Elijah managed at home with the help of a woman from town named Clara who came to care for Henry and Rosa during the days. The night before she left, they sat on the porch in the dark and she leaned against him and they listened to the coyotes calling across the mesa. "I'll be back in 2 months," she said. "I know," he said. "You're not going to ask me not to go." "No," he said. "It's important work. You're the right person for it." He pressed his lips to the top of her head. "I'll write you every week." "So will I," she said. The letters that passed between them during those 2 months were, Alberta thought later, some of the best writing either of them ever produced. Elijah's letters were careful and dry, and occasionally very funny, and always deeply honest about what he was thinking and feeling, which she had come to understand was the way he showed love, through the willingness to be known. Her letters were longer and more discursive and contained observations about the negotiations and the landscapes and the people she was meeting that she knew he would read carefully and think about. She was late in the 2nd month writing to him because the negotiations had reached a critical point, and when she finally sat down to write, she found she had 3 pages of things she needed to tell him before she could begin to address the negotiations themselves, and the 3 pages were almost entirely about missing him, which she had never experienced before with any particular intensity, and which she found both inconvenient and entirely reasonable. The commission was successful. The land use protocols she helped establish were not perfect, because nothing involving federal land management in the 1880s could be perfect, but they were more protective of indigenous land rights than any previous agreements in the territory, and they were documented in the forms that Alberta had developed and refined over years of work. She came home 2 months and 4 days after she had left, arriving at the Cimarron Ranch in the late afternoon with dust on her coat and her satchel across her chest, and Elijah was on the porch before she had finished dismounting. He held her for a long time. She let herself be held. "The children are well?" she asked, into his shoulder. "Thriving," he said. "Rosa has taught the dog to sit on command using only Spanish. I'm not sure whether to be impressed or concerned." "Impressed," Alberta said, laughing. "Definitely impressed," he agreed. She went inside to find Henry, who was now 5 and possessed of the kind of elaborate questions about why things were the way they were that kept adults in a constant state of effortful explanation, waiting by the kitchen table with a picture he had drawn for her that depicted, as far as she could tell, a woman on a horse in a very large landscape, surrounded by words in an alphabet of his own invention. "That's the language you speak with the people in the valley," he told her seriously. "Almost," she said, pulling him close. "When you're older, I'll teach you the real one." "Will you teach me all of them?" he asked. "Every one I know," she said, "and then you'll go and learn ones I don't." He considered this with the deep seriousness of a 5-year-old taking on a significant responsibility. "All right," he said. They had one more child, their youngest, another boy born in 1882, whom they named James Domingo Vaughn, after Elijah's father and after Domingo Reyes, who wept openly, and with great dignity when he learned of the middle name. James was an easy, sunny-tempered child who grew up in a house full of languages and books, and the constant movement of a woman who was never finished learning, and a man who admired this unreservedly. The ranch grew to its fullest extent in the mid-1880s, by which point it was one of the more prosperous cattle operations in northern New Mexico territory, known for its fair management, its sound agreements, and the remarkable woman who was part of its operation in the capacity that suited her. Alberta had, by this point, published 3 scholarly papers, 2 collections of documented oral histories, and a slim volume of practical notes on Plains Indian languages that was used by territorial interpreters throughout the region as a working reference. She had received a formal letter of commendation from the governor's office for her work on the land use protocols. She had also, on 2 separate occasions, been offered academic positions at Eastern universities, which she declined with polite letters explaining that her work required her to be in the field. She had no regrets about this. One evening in the autumn of 1885, she and Elijah were sitting on the porch together in the cooling air, watching the sun go down behind the mountains in the particular combination of gold and rose that this part of New Mexico produced with remarkable regularity. Henry was inside doing arithmetic, a subject he found interesting in the way he found most things interesting. Rosa was at the neighbor's property visiting a friend, which had required negotiation because Rosa conducted her social life with the same forceful confidence she brought to everything. James was asleep, as 3-year-olds tended to be at this hour. "I've been thinking about the spring boundary survey," Elijah said. He was talking about an upcoming review of the grazing boundaries that required fresh documentation, the kind of detailed, on-the-ground survey that they had done 3 times before. "Hawk Standing has asked whether you'll be part of it." "Of course," she said. She looked at the mountains. "I was thinking I'd also use the time to continue documenting the seasonal vocabulary variations. There are patterns in the way the language changes with the seasons that I've been tracking for 2 years, and I want enough data to write something definitive." "Of course you do," he said, and there was nothing in his voice but warmth. He had long since given up pretending to be surprised by the scope of what she did. She looked at him in the fading light. He was gray at his temples now, which looked entirely natural on him, as if he had always been growing toward this version of himself. His hands on the porch rail were the same hands, calloused and strong and warm. He was watching the mountains with the patient, steady attention that was so characteristically his, the look of a man who was entirely at home in the world he had built. "Elijah," she said. He looked at her. "I want you to know," she said, "that this is the best version of a life I could have imagined, not a different version, this one." He looked at her for a moment, and then he reached over and took her hand in both of his, the way he had on the first long-ago evening in Cimarron when she had asked him about his past, and he turned it over and looked at it with the expression that was still, after all these years, slightly astonished that she was real and that she was his. "You walked out of the tree line speaking Comanche," he said, "and you told me to stop talking, and I thought you were the most extraordinary person I had ever seen in my life, and I still think that every single day. You were about to start a war with a medicine show pamphlet," she said. "I was," he agreed. "It was a very bad pamphlet." She laughed, and he laughed with her, and the mountains caught the last light and held it for a moment before letting it go, and the night came in quietly from the east, and inside the house the lamp was lit and warm against the dark, and she leaned her head against his shoulder and felt the solid certainty of a life that had been built honestly, with care, and with the full and irreversible knowledge of who they each were. The Vaughn Ranch stood for a long time in the northern New Mexico territory, and people in those parts, for many years afterward, would tell the story of the boundary agreement and the woman who had negotiated it and the cattle operation that had held to it. And they would say that it was one of the few stories from that time that ended well for everyone, which was a rare enough thing that it deserved remembering. Hawk Standing's people and the Vaughn operation managed the shared spring for 30 years, through drought and flood, and the considerable changes that the turning of the century brought to the territory. Alberta's published oral histories were held in libraries in 4 different cities and were cited in academic work across 3 decades. Henry Vaughn grew up to be a man of considerable learning who spoke 4 languages by the time he was 20, just as his mother had promised him. Rosa Vaughn grew up to be a woman of such formidable competence and character that the stories about her could fill another book entirely. James Vaughn raised cattle and told stories, and resembled his father in temperament so closely that it sometimes made Alberta stop and look at him with a particular fullness in her chest. And Alberta Lockhart, who had ridden into a clearing in the New Mexico Canyon country in the year 1874, with her satchel across her chest and her languages in her mind, and her considerable intelligence at full strength, and who had walked into the middle of a potential disaster and solved it by doing what she had always done, by speaking truthfully across the distance between people who could not otherwise hear each other. Lived the rest of her life in the full and generous extent of everything she was, beside the man who had never once wished her to be less. She was, as she had always been, precisely and completely herself, and that, in the end, was the story worth telling.